And kind of what ends up happening is just like we end up realizing that, there is no excuse for narcissistic abuse. And just because there might be, a trauma or biological predisposition involved, it doesn't mean that the abusive narcissistic behavior gets a free pass. And no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what the brain is like or how it's wired, accountability is just one of those things. It's just we can't dodge it. And no matter what the narcissists believe or what excuses they give. And it's like, of course they don't take responsibility. Of course they don't take accountability. Like, why should they? Because they can just manipulate things. They can twist things. And somebody just needs to believe that they were in the wrong, even if it's just them, in order for this fantasy of theirs to become a reality. And, if they can convince just even one person that this twisted story that they concocted is even, 30% of it might actually be true, then that false reality that they've just created absolves them of accountability, or at least it does in their mind. And that's just the way their brains are wired. But it doesn't actually absolve them of accountability or responsibility. It's like a real interesting reality that they create, isn't it? And to them, it doesn't matter if they're a superhero or a supervillain. It really doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, it's super, and they're super. Both of them are super. And you know what that means? That means it's like having the excuse of saying something like, I was bitten by a radioactive spider. So you know what that means? That means I should be able to rob a bank or sell bootleg Taylor Swift albums out of the trunk of my car at one of her shows. And, for the younger generation, an album, you may have to Google that, because that's just it's like an ancient form of recording music and listening to music. It's probably not the best metaphor. I should probably rethink that. I should have spent more time on this. And what about this myth? What about this myth that hurt people hurt people? Is it even a myth, or is it a reality when we're dealing with narcissism? And because what is the truth? The truth is that not everyone who's been hurt turns into a narcissistic hurting machine. Many traumatized people are like real-life superheroes, exhibiting even more compassion, more empathy, and more of a conscious and a bigger awareness of their own place in the world. And yet, for these hurt people, that's not the case. And we start to wonder, it's like, are they actually choosing to hurt people and to hurt others? Because the people that have been hurt and turn around and become even more compassionate, well, they kind of take the mindset of, I went through hell, and I'll be damned if I drag others around with me. Like, that's noble, that's real. And here's the difference. The narcissist went through hell, and then what they want to do is bring more people with them. Like, that's evil. And you can see the difference. Both are hurt people, but their response to the hurt are two different things. And I would love to just kind of package everything up into a pretty little bow and a little package and just say, here's the causes of the narcissistic personality disorder. But unfortunately, I can't, because it's really complicated. Think of it as like a web of intrigue. The causes of narcissistic personality disorder is just like a jigsaw puzzle that's missing a few pieces, and no one has a clear picture of what the actual causes are. It turns out to be this weird, cosmic cocktail of biological predisposition and environmental factors, where nature and nurture are just kind of, always just locked in this eternal dance. And as soon as, science or PhDs or doctors of this and that start to look closer, it's almost like, it's like, when you have that weird noise in your car and you go to a mechanic and then they pop the hood and you're paying them $150 an hour. And all of a sudden your car's running perfectly in that moment. They just listen and they don't hear anything. A lot of times that's kind of a similar case to just narcissistic people. You can point out all these traits. And then when they're actually being diagnosed, and they can just kind of, act normal for long enough, and they can pass whatever, personality test that they're undergoing. But regardless of all of that, I don't want any of that stuff to be too confusing, because, all of it is part of cracking the code on narcissism. And, we touched into, genes, brains, the choices where everything kind of intersects: environment, people, connections. And I'm sorry if we're following the story as if it's like a movie, and finally we get to the ending, and it's just there's not a satisfying ending there. But none of that actually really matters, because the behavior is the behavior. What we need to focus on now is you, how this affects you, how this confusing little monster that's over there can stay over there, and how you can go towards things that you actually can control. And that's mostly your emotions and your perspective of this entire situation. And the nature versus nurture thing, it becomes really, really complicated, but it's not actually the whole story. So it is true that nature and nurture do have an intersection. And it becomes almost this, cosmic dance between, genes and environment. And disorders like this one, like narcissism, NPD, they can emerge from, just the interaction of these biological environmental factors. You can think of it as like a superhero's origin story where, genetics lay at the foundation. But life experiences and those epic plot twists, well, these become personality disorders, just like in narcissism. And they end up being a mix of both nature and nurture. It's like, a superhero and a villain's backstory that are all just kind of mixed up into one. What's less important than the origins of narcissism, and understanding that completely, is more of the protective factors and, your own personal risk factors. Because protective factors are almost like your shield that can defend you against, the dark forces of narcissism. And this includes, having a strong support network, access to therapy, a positive upbringing, or cultural beliefs, your cultural beliefs, or the culture that you grew up in. These all things that kind of play a part of it. And then on the flip side of all the risk factors, and these little things, these little environmental forces, they make the journey to recovery a bit more perilous sometimes, because these traumatic backgrounds, having an overvalued upbringing, exposure to violence and other traumas, just can put us on the edge of darkness and get us sucked into their own darkness. And yeah, it's true. Narcissists can come from various backgrounds. They can come from traumatic backgrounds, absolutely. And they can also come from overvalued backgrounds, where they were just made to feel special all the time. And they go out into the world carrying this belief and try and make it true. And this, this excessive sense of just entitlement can come out at a very early age. And it's almost like they've been given the cape of a villain from birth almost. And one of the things that be really keep people cognizant of and be mindful of is just the danger of narcissistic partners. And it can feel like, a suspenseful thriller. Being in a relationship with someone that's sporting the, narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, is like, living in a toxic, psychological minefield. That because of, their lack of empathy and their exploitative tendencies, they can wreak havoc on our emotional landscape. It's almost like, living with Kanye West, where it's just like, you never know what they're going to say next. And what they said yesterday gets forgotten, and this is what they're saying now. And a belief can be just something that they feel, and then they blurt out, and then it's real. Don't need facts. Don't need proof. And sometimes it's just being contradictory for the sake of being contradictory. Yeah, I know, deep in the back of our minds, we still have this nagging little question of why and how. And this is where the reality starts to bend and things get even more confusing. Asking why and how someone developed NPD can sometimes just muddy the waters of accountability and shifting the blame onto the victim. But remember, understanding the causes should never dissolve an abuser from their responsibility for their hurtful choices, for their hurtful actions. People with a narcissistic personality disorder can still be held accountable for their abusive behavior. They don't get off with an insanity plea here. And especially it's true if they refuse to seek professional help to change, or that they even acknowledge that there's a problem. Now, compassion, it is possible for compassion to coexist with accountability, but it shouldn't blind us to the ongoing abuse. And what we end up telling people, it's just like, comic book reference, it's like telling a villain, it's like you're responsible for your actions no matter what your backstory is. And then we redefine what a villain is, what a bad guy is. And the reality is, it's like bad people are bad people because they did bad things. And it has nothing to do with their backstory. You erase the backstory. Actions are actions. And if there's actions, there's accountability for those actions. And that's something that just stays true now, forever, and always. Now, in order to just untangle from this narcissistic web that we're in, there's a bunch of things that we need to understand first. And a lot of this has to do with just cracking the code of narcissism. And that's actually going into the whole nature, nurture, and basically the whole human condition. And all the elements that kind of got us vulnerable to these, susceptible to, just these narcissistic tactics. And this debate on narcissism, whether it's nature or nurture, well, it ends up just kind of being this showdown at the OK Corral. Because there isn't confirmed clarity on one or the other. And the big question becomes is heredity a part of narcissism or not? And there is evidence to suggest that it is. There was a twin study that was done that suggested narcissism does run in the families. And it's the whole narcissism spectrum is just part of, a genetic legacy. But here's the weird bit. Parents alone are not the sole architects of their children's narcissism. And there's enough evidence to show that even that, some parents with narcissistic children do manage to provide a loving and validating home for their kids. And what ends up happening is it's kind of like a genetic lottery with a side of upbringing. And to understand this a bit further, we can go into the biological and neurological factors that are at play. And what you can do is just picture the brain of somebody with a NPD or a narcissistic personality disorder. And looking at it, it's like we're looking at these puzzles, and this puzzle of a brain of theirs has a few missing pieces. And there is research out there that has shown that there are structural abnormalities that are just related towards, just compassion and empathy in these narcissistic individuals. It's almost like they're just wired differently. When you look at at it, it's like, oh my God, there's some gray matter in there, and there's some pieces missing in this melon of a brain. And what they found is the wiring inside the brain has just kind of worked its way around, bypassing, the compassion and empathy chambers of their, the brainosphere. And it all has to do with the question of, does a narcissist have the capacity for empathy? And that alone is a puzzle unto itself. And even though narcissists seem to often appear as just this empathetic brick wall, they're still capable of a form of empathy that's just called cold empathy or intellectual empathy. It's like they have this secret power of empathy, but they just choose not to use it. And just because there might be some brain wiring that's completely gone wrong, it does not excuse their behavior, nor does it absolve them of accountability. They're still accountable for their actions and their behaviors and consequences for those actions and those behaviors. And in the recovery process, what we're going to start to realize is that, self-compassion and self-care are the ultimate survival tool in recovery from narcissistic abuse. Prioritizing self-compassion and, self-care is essential for survivors with dealing with partners who have MPD. It's like, putting on this impenetrable armor of self-love and detaching from the abusive partner who may or may not even have this disorder, because it actually doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's all about protecting your well-being. It's about, your inner landscape. This is your city, and self-care is you. I am Gotham and I'm Batman at the same time, protecting Gotham. So we be a vigilante of self-care. I hope you like this information. I hope this resonates with you. I hope you find it powerful. And if you do, please, like, share, follow. I have hundreds of videos on my feed. You can follow me on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok, and YouTube.